Hi everyone. Welcome to another episode of Unpacking Possibility. I'm your host, Traci Stein. As always, I'm really so happy to be here with you tonight. I was thinking about what should we chat about tonight, and you know, something that people have brought up as an issue again and again is the issue of the inner critic. So many of us struggle with the inner critic. So I thought that tonight what I would do is talk about really what the inner critic is. You probably have a sense, but we'll talk about also what problems the inner critic can cause for all of us, most of us, and also 5 things we can do to address the inner critic. Now, just as an aside, I remember, for years I taught at the Spirituality Mind Body Institute. I stepped down a little over a year ago to focus on other things, but every year I would speak to a large group of students about my class, and I would do an exercise to kind of illustrate the impact of mind body approaches. It can be very rapid that we can experience a shift. I really believe that. There's research to show that that's true. But perhaps for me, the most compelling evidence was that every time I did this particular workshop version of a presentation and did this inner critic and inner ally meditation, people were really very moved and found it very transformative. And every once in a while, I'll receive an email, no joke, from somebody who maybe did this like 5, 6 years ago or more. And the impact has still been pretty lasting in a positive way. So that will be technique number 5 for disarming the inner critic. But what I wanted to do before we get to the tips again is just talk a little bit about what it is. Um, Most people honestly have an inner critic. I'm sure there's a small subset who don't. Their challenges will be different. We're not dealing with that tonight. But the inner critic, you know that. It's that voice that you may be consciously aware of. Sometimes you're probably not. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's this critical voice. Usually it's pretty harsh and it's very quick to point out everything we are not doing right, not doing well enough, things we could screw up, and so forth, right? There's a range of how constant and harsh and intrusive the inner critic can be, but most of us have been aware at some point consciously of feeling that voice saying, don't do that, or don't screw up, or, oh, you can't get anything right, or whatever your version is. Um, some people's inner critics really work overtime. I'm using that word for a reason because later on we're going to reframe how we think about how we relate to the inner critic. So often people who seem to really have it together have especially harsh inner critics. That's not news to people who have one. Um, but a lot of times it's the people we wouldn't think of as needing to have one that might have the most vocal inner critic. I'm going to talk about that more in a second. Um, that person could actually have a relentless inner critic, and there are reasons why. Most of us, I think, have a somewhat complicated relationship with our inner critics. The reason for that is it's a relationship. You may not have thought about that before. It's more than just an inner voice, but your inner critic is kind of like a being, right? Remember how I've talked about before how we have this movie in our minds and these scripts we live by? Well, the inner critic is kind of like a character in the screenplay of your life. The inner critic has been written in, and they feel very much like they have a role. Now, of course, the inner critic is an aspect of you, but it's an aspect of you that might seem like somebody else you know, Often it is, some different version maybe. Um, but it's something we have internalized and it has taken on a life of its own. But that's okay because we're going to work with that. Um, some people just feel really overwhelmed by the inner critic, right? Or they feel really cowed by the inner critic. They feel really intimidated by, they may feel hopeless in response to the inner critic, like, I just can't get it right. Why even bother? And when we're depressed, we're more likely to have that kind of response, that why bother? And if you have this version, you may find yourself avoiding things that could otherwise be things that might even give you great joy and pleasure, things that might make your life better, that might expand your world in the best possible way, right? But if you're super afraid that you can't get it right and failing seems like the worst possible thing, you might just avoid a lot of things you otherwise would do altogether. If you're somebody who is socially anxious and this comes out at work or at school or in your social life, you may find that you get dressed up for the party and you don't go. Or before you've even gotten there, you have decided that you can only stay, I don't know, 5 minutes or whatever. You may decide that, it would be great to join your local recreational soccer league because you like playing soccer, but you're so worried about embarrassing yourself or not being as good as the other players or whatever that maybe you sign up and you never do it or you miss, you know, 60% of the games. You know what I'm talking about, right? So that's one type of relationship with the inner critic. And your relationship might be a little bit fluid. It might be that way a lot of the time and a different way another time. Um, because some people, like many of us in our real life relationships, might feel a kind of dependency on the inner critic, like they need it. If they don't have the inner critic telling them all the ways they could screw up, what catastrophe might befall them? What trouble might they get themselves into? It's always interesting when people come in and have that issue because a lot of times it's like the excellent students or the really good citizens, the people who strive to just be a force for good, to not get in trouble. But there are reasons for why they might feel like they need the inner critic to keep them on the straight and narrow path, as they used to say back in the day, not deviating, not coloring outside the lines, that kind of thing. So the problem is if you think you need the inner critic, or else you'll make some colossal error or become a terrible person or mess up like so and so that might be someone that you knew about or knew of or knew personally when you were growing up. What's going to happen is you will have this oddly kind of maybe codependent relationship with the inner critic. Again, you're not going to really fully want to tame the inner critic because then what would happen to you? It's like the guardrails are off. Then what's going to happen? So just keep that in mind if that is something you recognize, right? Um, so, you know, it's going to be harder to let go of or change that relationship. The thing with that version of the inner critic and your relationship to that inner critic is that what can happen is you can wind up looking for people in your life, a boss, friends, partner, and so forth, who also are very much like that hypercritical inner critic. So you may feel like the people who find everything that's wrong with you, even if a part of you hates it, even if a part of you rebels against it, you may find yourself somehow winding up with that person again and again in your life because a part of you maybe subconsciously feels you need that. Okay. Um, I'm just thinking back, I'm a child of the 70s and 80s, and I don't know if this is still as common. I'm thinking it isn't, and I'm hoping it isn't. But the old school gym teacher or coach, that kind of stereotype that wasn't untrue of that coach or gym teacher who would talk to you like you were worthless or talk to you like you're going to screw up colossally or you're a failure or you're just not trying hard enough. And, you're going to be running. When I was in high school, I was actually a horrendously timid and not good field hockey player, but I did play for 2 years because a friend of mine said, "Oh, this would be a great idea." I hated every moment of it, I'm just disclosing that, but, I remember we had to run a time 2-mile run. We had to try and get it in under 16 minutes, so we had to do 8 minutes per mile or faster. And we would be running all summer long in preparation for the fall season. And, you know, you're running on uneven ground, you're running in a uniform, it's hot and humid. And to make a long story short, we would have this person barking at us, basically saying, that we weren't doing a good enough job. And I remember seeing other people vomiting, not kidding, um, off to the side by, like, the fence framing the field, and, I just that is to me the embodied version of the inner critic, the person who thinks that to motivate you, they have to demean, devalue, frighten you, tell you you're not amounting to anything, that sort of thing, and people call it tough love. I'm not sure I agree with that, I just think it's kind of aggressive and unnecessary and kind of awful. And I think a lot of people internalize that, right? Oftentimes it's our parents who are super critical and unpleasable, and that can be the case as well. That's, people who don't really matter to us or who are barely in our lives tend not to become really important inner characters. They tend not to become these very significant mental representations. That's a psychological term, right? So somebody being rude at the grocery store, unless they are familiar in some way to some type of person or interaction that has been significant to you, you're not going to sit around thinking about that and you're not going to internalize them. But if you have the parent who cannot tolerate anything less than an A, or the parent who only praises exemplary performance, right? Like that's the minimum, that's the lowest the bar can go. And even really fine or adequate performance is like shame worthy. You're going to wind up probably having a pretty significant inner critic because someone is going to become internalized in some way in your mind, the person who is the outer critic. And even if you feel like that's not true, and you tell the person that's not true, so often we wind up internalizing those feelings of not being able to be okay unless we're perfect. And you see perfectionistic people, um, if they're not really bound by the inner critic in later life, it's because they've done a lot of work on themselves. And I'm thinking of person after person after person, not just patients, colleagues, friends, relatives, etc. So the inner critic is trying to keep you from failing, is trying to make you perform. They've been internalized early on. That's probably not um, a surprise to you. It's reinforced by teachers or coaches or other people in your life, partners, again, who really don't, there's not a lot of leeway. Um, you can be, and I'm not kidding, and this is not, I'm not making this up out of, I'm not pulling this out of thin air. I am thinking of people who, even in early grade school, you've got to study hard, you've got to do well, or you've got to be a great athlete, or whatever it is, because you're going to want to get into a good high school. This person could be in fifth grade, and then you're going to need to get into a great high school and perform exceptionally well there. And then you're going to need to go to a great college or a great graduate school or whatever it is, or get a great job and get the right partner. And it's like this never ending series of things in the future that not only do you have to achieve to be okay, but one little screw up, you better not fail that third grade spelling test. And it's ridiculous, right? Your logical mind isn't the part that usually has the hardest time disassembling these kind of really erroneous beliefs. It's this other part of you. It's deeper and it's older, right? Um, and maybe it's you listening to this, or maybe it's someone you know, or maybe this is what you've come from, and maybe you're now starting to think about how you're speaking to your own children. We're not meant to be perfect. And I know that might sound like BS to someone who's like, well, yes, you do. And you're just saying that. But it's actually true. And honestly, most people don't find, quote, perfect people all that enjoyable because there's something inauthentic and something anxiety provoking about being with somebody who's so driven that they cannot live, right? So many moments of their life wind up becoming so devalued by themselves that they cannot enjoy them. That it's almost like you're living for the next thing for 80 something years and that's it. And that's really sad. And it does not have to be that way. Okay. Now, I want to tell you that I'm using examples of performing in school or performing at sports, but it could be a million other things, right? It depends on what's important in the context or situation where you are raised to be this way. But it can also kind of morph into other areas where you feel like if it's not perfect, I'm a failure and it's a disaster. So, in some families, and I find like this is especially true for women, but it's not only for women, but just societally, we find this more common in women, and there's good reason. And again, doesn't mean men can't suffer from this too, but the pressure to look perfect. And there are a million different iterations of that, right? So if you had a parent or a friend group even or whatever, and you had to be perfectly groomed and wear, only the right clothes, or, your hair had to be perfect or whatever that means for you, or maybe you had to be perfectly fit. Your inner critic may work overtime to make sure that you do not leave the house without a full face of makeup or without your hair being perfectly coiffed. Or you may not be able to afford the hair extensions that you have to look like a Hollywood celebrity. But you may say, I'm willing to go without a few meals. And I'm not exaggerating, to look this way all the time. For somebody else, it's going to be neatly pressed clothing and perfectly polished shoes, and that might be more a throwback to an earlier era. Um, it might be the perfect handbag. You can't be seen with something that's out of style or not up to par. It could be the perfect nails, or this could morph into being seen at only the right places, restaurants, whatever. Um, it's whatever it is that you feel like not only elevates your self-worth, but again, the flip side, the quiet part of that is preventing you from being like a disaster, your version of it. The thing that's really insidious about the inner critic is that it can convince you that it isn't the inner critic driving this, but it's that it's just the right way to do things. So you may feel as critical of other people who don't measure up as you will be with yourself, you via the inner critic, right? Um, so you might be somebody who, and listen, we all have our own version to our own degree and our own times of having like, oh my God, I'm just, I'm going to own it. Like one of the examples I wanted to give is somebody stops by your house and it's a hot mess. And, we've all had our homes be a hot mess, I'm assuming, unless you have a fleet of people to help you take care of them all the time, right? I don't know whether your kid's sick and maybe you have the flu and stuff just is left all over the place, or your pets have like just destroyed something and now the doorbell rings, or, for whatever reason, your house didn't get cleaned this week. And whatever it is. Or maybe you've got peeling wallpaper. I don't know. Or things you need to repair and you haven't gotten to them yet. And we can all feel self-conscious about things. I'm not even talking just about garden variety self-consciousness. To be honest, if you ring my doorbell and my house is a hot mess, I'm going to think twice about whether I want to answer that doorbell. I'm just being honest. I'm human, just like everybody else. And that's going to be related to one of our techniques for not being um, dominated by the inner critic. But somebody else might not answer the door because they don't have a full face of makeup. Or somebody might fail an exam or just not do as well as they wanted to and feel so depressed that they can't get out of bed for a few days. That's kind of what I mean. I don't mean just the little kind of quiet version of the inner critic. I mean the capital I, capital C, running the show, scary monster under the bed. That's what I mean. For somebody else, the inner critic is going to fuel their social anxiety. And that's going to kind of lead me into the next issue with the inner critic is that lots of our mental health issues, right? So whether it's social anxiety, generalized anxiety, a depressive disorder, um, if it's an eating disorder, um, some other mental health issues, substance use, some sort of anxiety where you're picking at your skin or your nails or your hair. It's not that those things don't have a myriad of causes, they do. But the inner critic is both something that is fueled by those issues, and it's also something that makes those issues more worse for you. And there actually is some research showing that if you have really severe self-criticism, it's harder for you to benefit from psychotherapy. It doesn't mean that you can't, but it means that it's that much harder for you to do so. So it's really worth taking a look at the inner critic. It's worth looking at your inner critic. And it's worth getting to know it better, which honestly is often the last thing people want to do because it's, again, this scary figure. It's like, this monster from a movie. It's the thing that kind of lurks in the recesses of our mind. And if you think about the inner critic like a monster from a movie, when it's dark, you ever notice how every monster movie or ghost movie or something, like, look at the sets. The lighting is always really bad. I'm always wondering why nobody turns on the lights in these scary movies. There's a ghost in the house in the scary movie, and everybody's sitting there with maybe one lamp on, and it's otherwise completely black outside and dark inside, but there's something to be said metaphorically and literally for turning on the light. right? Because turning on the light illuminates things. If you walk into a dark room, there's very little you can see, and the corners kind of recede off into the distance. You don't really know what's before you. You turn on the light switch, and now you know what you're dealing with. And it's just a room. And maybe it's messy or maybe it's neat, but it's still just a room. And you can address what's in the room. And it's the same thing with your inner critic and your mind. Um, because what I don't want you to do is think this is just you, this is just your fate, so that if you're somebody whose inner critic is feeling your social anxiety, you're going to go to a party, be there for 2 minutes or however long you're there, no matter how it goes, you're going to go home and be up all night ruminating over every little minor thing that you didn't do as well as you thought you should, and you know suffering over how it's the death of your social life, and maybe nothing happened at all, right? Or whatever happened, you're human like everyone else. Again, that's going to be part of one of our strategies for helping to really put the inner critic in its place. Yeah. So a few more things I wanted to say before we get to the tips is that your relationships, again, can be very affected by your having a super strong inner critic. And there's a few reasons for that. So, another reason for addressing this one is that it's actually stressful to be around somebody whose inner critic is working overtime to the point that either you have to constantly reassure them, but that you can't really make a difference, right? So people feel very helpless sometimes around people whose inner critic is like, no, it's terrible. I'm never going to be able to do it. And they're trying to point out all the evidence to the contrary, but your inner critic won't allow you to take that in. It's exhausting. It's hard for our friends and loved ones to sit with all the time. They love you and they're going to keep trying, hopefully, but they can feel as helpless as you do. You probably weren't aware of that. Um, the other thing is, again, if your inner critic, depending on the flavor of your inner critic, it's not only critical of you, but that can get projected onto everybody else in your life. So you may be just as worried that your kids or your partner don't measure up, right? Or your friends don't measure up or whatever, that they're under the same microscope that you are under, right? Because there's such a fear of being exposed and of shame. People with a really strong inner critic can have a huge problem with imposter syndrome. They can have a huge problem with becoming hypercritical people themselves and creating really, really kind of ruthless inner critics in their own children and other people around them. So then we can't tolerate ourselves when we don't live up to these impossible standards, but we then also can't tolerate other people not being able to. So just keep in mind that there are so many reasons now to take a look at this. Even if you are one of the people who has had a fairly dependent relationship with the inner critic, you can change it. You can. We know that social media only exacerbates this problem. If you need to take a little social media fast, I think you should. It's not a bad idea. It just fuels more unrealistic expectations, and they're not real either. And people on social media tell you all the time, but it's true. So, okay, we've talked about a lot. We've talked about how even successful people have harsh inner critics. That a harsh inner critic can worsen other mental health issues. You have social issues and so forth. How can we change this? Because we can. And that's perhaps the most important message here. So, number one, I'm going to mention is self compassion. Now, by the way, I'm aware that the idea of being self compassionate can feel impossible when your problem is that you're not self compassionate, right? And then somebody's saying, well, just be self compassionate. Now, let's talk about that. Self compassion, for anybody who wants to look this up, and also because she has free in really great meditations. Dr. Kristen Neff, and also Dr. Christopher Germer are the ones who really brought the idea of self-compassion as a psychological tool and construct into the forefront of psychological research and into the kind of common lexicon of things that are helpful, approaches that are helpful for a variety of things. Now, if you're one of the people who feels like, no, I need my inner critic, just so you know, you not only won't like let yourself off the hook for things you should be responsible for by being self-compassionate, but self-compassionate people tend to feel better. People who feel better, honestly, tend to do better, and they tend to be more compassionate with other people. And I can tell you right now, with that information alone, you should already be thinking, my life could feel happier and more joyful if I wasn't feeling like I'm being berated constantly. It's true. You wouldn't expect a flower to grow if you poured acid on it, right? No. You're going to water and fertilize it, give it sunlight, put it in good soil, or are you going to dump vinegar and acid and, stomp on it? And I know it's a harsh example, but it's kind of true. So self-compassionate um, practices include things like mindfulness. You've already heard a ton about it. I won't go on and on about it tonight. I also have an audio program with Hay House, but you can find um, innumerable mindfulness resources for low cost and for free. You don't have to use mine, but mindfulness learning through simple practices to cultivate a present moment focus and awareness, what's happening in the now, in a way that involves your inner observer. So you're observing your thoughts and feelings and judgments as mental events, because that's all they are. They are like clouds moving through the sky. The reason people use that example and that metaphor so much is because just as you could no longer grab onto a cloud and keep it still or unchanging, you can't do that with your thoughts either. Whether you think about them or don't, they're constantly shifting and changing. They're intangible, even though they can have a really significant impact on our body, our minds, our life. So a mindfulness practice actually helps us to put things in perspective. I highly recommend it. It's good for about a million other things as well. Lots of free resources out there. Check it out. So mindfulness, common humanity. That is the second pillar of self-compassion practice. Now, common humanity means recognizing that you and I, just like every other person in the world, we're just human. That's it. There is no such thing as perfection. It's an illusion. It gets in the way of learning. And we all are here to learn and grow. We make mistakes. That's just part of life, right? You are not different, even though you want to believe you are. And that's our ego talking. But from any of the billions of people on the planet, in the sense that you're human. And how liberating is it that once you remember, if you're human, it's kind of your job to be imperfectly perfect, right? To just be and learn and grow and to forgive yourself when things aren't exactly the way you want them to be, and you get up the next day and you try again. That's it. So mindfulness, common humanity, and the third pillar of self-compassion practice is self-kindness. So you want to be that voice that you needed when you were younger, be the voice you need when you're vulnerable, right? Kindness. Everybody makes mistakes. It's okay, right? You can imagine the wisest part of you. I do this in a lot of my imagery and affirmations for a reason. You can imagine the wisest part of you, the most evolved part of you, the future you, however you want to think about that, telling you, we're in this together. I'm here for you. I love you, right? Notice how that makes you feel versus self criticism. So, number one is self compassion practice. Number two, and all of these are kind of related, is learning to reframe critical messages, right? And it does not matter if you don't believe it yet. Just take it as a given that it's going to take time and it'll feel awkward at first. Um, you can ask yourself, oh my God, when this feels like this is going to be a colossal failure if this isn't perfect. Almost nothing is. Very few things are, right? Is it a colossal failure? Maybe reframe it in a way that is actually true. It's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for learning and growth. To succeed or fail, sometimes, a lot of times, it doesn't even matter, honestly. Um, Maybe it's just an opportunity to learn and practice, right? That's an example of reframing. And it's reframing in a more realistic way. Okay. Um, See what happens. Because, remember that what the inner critic says to you, it's not only critical, but it's usually a very exaggerated version of the worst case situation. It's usually even worse than it's likely to go. It's a scare tactic. And you don't have to accept that. I mean, if you knew someone was just trying to make you miserable and scare you, how long would you really want to put up with that? Right? Bye, Felicia, as they say, right? Come on, you wouldn't want to tolerate that. And you shouldn't tolerate that from your inner critic either. So, number three, and it's related, practice decatastrophizing. So, catastrophizing is just a psychological term for taking something that's not good and making it like into something that is exponentially worse. It's like saying, you burned your finger while you were cooking on the stove, and now you've made it into like a volcano in your kitchen. It's not, right? You don't have to make that molehill into a mountain. You don't. And if you have a tendency to do this, you probably do it automatically. Um, you know, to use an example, if you're a student or somebody at a job and you need to make a presentation on something and you're worried it's not going to be great or people won't like it or you'll get critical feedback, the worst case scenario usually is going to be that you'll still just, you'll feel how you're going to feel. It's not going to last you a lifetime. It isn't. It's not going to be the thing you remember on your last day. And I'm serious. It's going to be an opportunity to gather more data, more information that you can use next time. And that next time can be even better, right? Even if it feels bad now. Okay. So, number four, I said this before with other things, and there's a reason, right? I'm never going to mention something without a reason. I might not always tell you all of the data, but anxiety that you have about things, and a lot of times it's anxiety, depression, a lot of times they go hand in hand. We usually think of these two things as very separate constructs. There's actually a lot of overlap, believe it or not. So I'm going to call it distress as kind of like a basket term. Distress. You can only feel so much distress when you are moving your body. So when you are anxious, when you are depressed, your posture is different, your muscle tension is worse. You'll probably have more pain, whether or not you normally have pain. If you do normally have a pain condition, typically it's worse. And that's a whole other podcast episode in and of itself because there are reasons for that. But the tension and the fatigue, believe it or not, that comes with that tension and the elevated heart rate or blood pressure, whatever it is, when you are feeling distressed, you will notice that once you are moving your body, you absolutely cannot feel as distressed. You can't. Try it. Don't take my word for it. So you'll find that, especially if you're holding a lot of muscular tension and you're doing yoga, you're going to feel relief. You're going to reduce that tension. You're going to change your posture, and your brain is going to register a different emotion. It will improve your mood. There's data to support this. But there's also data that regular exercise actually changes the brain. I'm going to give you a little aside about this. It not only helps you to improve connections between existing neurons or nerve cells, right? So your brain's working better and more efficiently. But believe it or not, it helps you create new neurons, new nerve cells in your brain. Part of what happens is you are less likely, the research shows, to have as many depressive episodes. They shouldn't be as severe. You'll have less, fewer instances of panic. Your anxiety will go down. And you know that if you exercise and get your heart rate up, and you often can feel that endorphin release, right? So your mood is literally improved. Your chemistry changes because you're exercising. And there are a million other reasons, good reasons to exercise. But you'll find that even catastrophic thoughts are much harder to sustain when you are exercising. And if you're doing something like jogging, you don't have to, but rhythmic, sustained exercise actually puts you into a bit of a trance state. That's also a time when you are more receptive to positive suggestions. So that's also a great time to listen to music you find inspirational, that tends to lift your mood or helps you feel empowered. Don't listen to sad music when you're sad, please. I've never really understood that. You don't need to do that, especially when you're really trying to shift out of that mood. Um, Number 4, the getting out and getting exercise is going to be good preparation for you to do the next exercise, actually. And this is the one that I have done with my students. I'm going to describe it here. If you would like me to record this, I'm thinking of recording this and putting it out there. I just haven't had a lot of time to do it. But in exercise, to get to know the inner critic, and then after that, get to know your inner ally. And you might not have even realized you have an inner ally, but you do. I think everybody has one. So the inner critic, as you know, is a mental construction. It is part of your awareness. We all have internalized representations of actual people, but of course they're different from the actual person because it's filtered through our own lenses. But we all have different aspects of ourself. Our inner landscape, the play of our lives takes place in our minds, and it's populated with a bunch of different characters, all aspects of ourselves, but that's not how our mind really interprets them. So the inner critic is like, again, the monster under the bed from when you were a little kid. You turn on the light, it's a lot less scary. So if you have a place where you can set aside time, give yourself like a half an hour, even an hour of time when you're not going to be disturbed, and have a notebook with you and create a space in your mind. And you don't have to be in a deep trance to do this, where you feel safe. It doesn't matter what it is. It may morph and change a little bit as you do the exercise and from one time doing it to another. But create a space where you make the rules. You're in charge. It's your space, it's your home, it's your rules, right? Because your mind is yours. It doesn't belong to the inner critic. You're actually the one in charge. So take charge. And you could invite the inner critic to join you in a cafe, right? Plenty of other people around if that helps you to feel safer. You're at that table and you decide when you want to invite them in, how close they can get, where they can sit at the table when they join you, or even if you want them to kind of stand a little ways away. Let the space, that safe space in your mind, be whatever resonates with you. And I'm sure whatever you come up with is exactly right. And you should trust that too. And you can ask the inner critic, you know, what is it you want? Why are you telling me these things that you're telling me? And wait and listen. Remember, if you feel like it's too much, you can tell the inner critic to leave. You're setting the stage. You are creating the space where you are the one making the rules. Notice what the inner critic looks like. Do they resemble anyone you know? They may or they may not. Do they sound like anyone you know? Maybe yes, maybe no. Are the things that they tend to say to you familiar? And you may decide you want to do this exercise with your therapist. If you're in therapy, that's a great place to do this exercise. Or if you have a close friend or someone else that you feel especially comfortable with, you can have them nearby while you do this exercise in your mind, or you can journal it if that feels better. But the point is, notice how they present, because you may not realize, the who the inner critic is channeling may surprise you even. It may not. Everything. Notice their gender. Notice what they're wearing. How did they approach you? How do they come in the room? Do they, are they quiet? Are they really verbal? What is it? You know, find out what their purpose is. Allow them to tell you. And then, because it's your space, you decide, what you're going to tolerate and what you're not. You could decide that you're going to give that inner critic another job entirely, or send them on a very long vacation. Again, you get to tell them if it's time for them to leave that cafe or other inner sanctuary. And you might have to do this exercise a few times before you really have a sense of who they are. Some people name the inner critic. Julia Cameron, very famous and prolific playwright, author, and more. I remember taking a workshop with her years ago, and she, I believe, had named her inner critic Nigel. And as she gave the inner critic a name, it really humanized it. Hers was male, humanized him. She'd never thought about it before, but she's a super creative person. So this was a perfect thing for her to come up with. But she changed the terms of their relationship. And she learned something from him. And you can learn too. This inner critic might be trying to protect you from something it doesn't need to protect you from anymore. You may want to tell it what you need. You can inform me like this and not like that. You can use this language with me, not that language with me. Or I think we're done working together. You get to choose. And again, I always encourage people, again, write it down, journal, it's worth it. Notice what you notice, because later on, over time, these things can reveal even more about, oh, I get it. I get why this was the voice and that I don't need it anymore. And then in the same session or in a separate one, you can, send the inner critic off somewhere and invite your inner ally. And it doesn't matter if you never had an idea of your inner ally before. That's not the point. The point is, you have an inner ally, and you probably have quite a few of them. And as you open yourself to the possibility of working with your inner ally and getting to know them, you might even find that others join you, and they each might do something different to help you. But you can ask what you need. Again, notice the same things about them. How do they present? Who do they remind you of, if anyone? What are they there to help you with? Can they help you with something specific? Is it more general? As you do this exercise, here and there, you will find that these characters may very well become more vivid, or even just that you don't need to do it because you've internalized the positive feedback that really helps you to grow. And remember, positive doesn't mean only telling you what you want to hear. If there's a time that you really need to be careful or prepare well, you can still do that. And you don't need somebody trying to demean you to help you stay safe and be careful and do a great job. So I hope this is helpful. Let me know what you think. And remember that you have so much power within you. Your mind is made to be helpful to you. That when you remember that, really incredible things can happen in the best possible way. And that's my hope for you. So until next time, of course, thank you for joining me. And as always, be well.